An invisible child, forgotten on the frozen streets, crosses paths with a man who had already given up on feeling. An unlikely encounter that will change everything, even what seemed beyond repair. The hot steam rising from the coffee cup contrasted with the cutting wind that swept across the cobblestone walkway of Pinecrest Village. Richard Parker adjusted his cashmere scarf around his neck and observed the typical movement of a Tuesday morning in Aspen Springs. Tourists carried shopping bags, couples took photos in front of European-style chalets, and the aroma of roasted chestnuts mixed with the cold mountain air. Sitting at the same table at Central Cafe, where he had been coming for years, Richard maintained the routine that had become his only anchor. Always the same table, always the same time, always the same double espresso. The waiters didn't even ask what he wanted anymore. They knew this elegant 52-year-old man, owner of one of the largest hotel chains in the region, who arrived punctually at 9 in the morning and stayed there for exactly 40 minutes, watching the world go by through the fogged-up windows. On that particular morning, however, something different happened. Richard was absent-mindedly leafing through a financial report when he noticed a small shadow slowly approaching his table. He looked up and saw a girl of apparently 8 or 9 years, barefoot despite the cold, covered by a torn blanket that looked more like an improvised shawl. Her brown hair was disheveled but clean, and her green eyes shone with an intensity that contrasted with the fragility of her small body. The girl stopped a few feet from the table, clearly hesitant. Her lips were cracked from the cold, and she trembled slightly, but she didn't extend her hand in a begging gesture like so many others Richard had seen on the streets. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the steaming cup and the half-eaten croissant that he had set aside. Richard felt something strange tighten in his chest. It wasn't the first time someone in a vulnerable situation had crossed his path, but there was something about this girl that was out of the ordinary. Perhaps it was her eyes, large and expressive, that seemed to carry stories too heavy for a child. Perhaps it was the way she didn't beg for pity, but just looked on with a silent dignity that touched something deep in his dormant soul. "Are you hungry?" Richard asked in a low voice, pushing the plate in her direction. The girl nodded almost imperceptibly, but didn't move. Richard realized that she was waiting for clearer permission, a confirmation that she really could approach. He gestured gently, indicating the empty chair across from him. "You can sit if you'd like." She approached slowly, like a wild animal that doesn't yet fully trust, and sat on the edge of the chair. She took the croissant delicately and began to eat small pieces, chewing slowly, as if she wanted to make it last as long as possible. Richard observed every movement, feeling a strange familiarity that he couldn't explain. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The girl stopped chewing for a moment, looked at him with those penetrating eyes but didn't answer. Instead, she continued eating in silence. Richard didn't insist. There was something in that silence that seemed more eloquent than many words. For the next 15 minutes they remained there, sharing an unusual quietness. Richard ordered a hot chocolate for the girl, which she accepted with a small smile that momentarily illuminated her tired face. When she finished drinking, she stood up, made a gesture that could be interpreted as thanks, and walked toward the street. Richard watched her walk away, noticing how she moved among people with a silent agility, almost invisible. There was something about her that intrigued him deeply, a feeling that their meeting had not been casual. The next day, Richard arrived at the cafe at the same time, not really expecting to see her again. But there she was, standing in the same place with the same blanket, the same attentive eyes. This time he had already ordered an extra snack before she appeared. The ritual was repeated. The girl approached, sat down, ate in silence, drank the hot chocolate, and left without saying a word. Richard began to notice small details he had missed in their first encounter. Her clothes, though worn, were relatively clean. Her fingernails, despite the surface dirt, were cared for. There was an organization to her appearance that suggested someone, or she herself, made efforts to maintain a basic dignity. On the third morning, Richard decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking direct questions, he began to talk about simple things while she ate. He commented on the weather, on the tourists passing by, on the city's preparations for the approaching winter festival. The girl listened attentively, occasionally nodding or showing small smiles, but maintained her silence. It was on the fourth morning that Richard noticed something that made him shudder. When the girl raised her hand to take the cup of chocolate, he saw a small scar on her right wrist in the shape of a half moon. For a moment, the world around seemed to stop. That mark was identical to one his own daughter had, the result of a bicycle fall when she was 6 years old. Richard felt his heart speed up, but forced himself to stay calm. Coincidences existed, he told himself, but something in the back of his mind began to form connections that he wasn't yet ready to face. When the girl got up to leave, Richard made an impulsive decision. Instead of returning to the office as he normally did, he decided to follow her discreetly. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself to act on impulse, but the silence of that girl seemed to carry a story that he needed to understand. She walked through quiet alleys of Pinecrest Village, then followed a trail between pine trees that Richard didn't even know existed. Her steps were sure, like someone who knew that path well. After about 20 minutes of walking, she stopped in front of an old building that Richard recognized as the former municipal library, closed for years due to lack of funds. The girl looked around, making sure she wasn't being observed, and slipped through a crack in the side door. Richard waited a few minutes before approaching. Through a dusty window, he glimpsed the interior. Among empty shelves and piles of abandoned books, there was a small organized space. An old mattress, folded blankets, some personal items arranged carefully. That's where she lived. Alone amid the ruins of a place that was once dedicated to knowledge and culture, Richard felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't identify as sadness, admiration, or something more complex. He returned home with more questions than answers, but with a growing certainty that his life was about to change irreversibly. That silent girl had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a need for connection that he thought he had lost forever. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stood on the veranda of his mansion, watching the lights of the city below, thinking of the girl sleeping alone in that abandoned library. For the first time in years, he felt that there was a purpose beyond mere survival waiting for him the next day. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. Richard arrived at the cafe the next morning with a discreet backpack containing children's clothes he had bought the night before. He wasn't quite sure how to offer them without scaring the girl, but he couldn't stop thinking about the cold she must feel sleeping in that abandoned library. She appeared at the usual time, but this time Richard noticed that she was walking with some difficulty. When she sat down, he realized she was coughing slightly and that her eyes looked more tired than usual. "Are you feeling okay?" Richard asked, discreetly moving the backpack closer. The girl nodded, but the cough persisted. Richard decided to be more direct. He opened the backpack and showed a small navy blue wool sweater. "I brought this for you. It's too cold to walk around with just that blanket." For the first time, she visibly hesitated. She looked at the sweater, then at Richard as if trying to decipher his intentions. Finally, she reached out and touched the soft fabric, a small smile appearing on her lips. Richard felt a wave of satisfaction that he hadn't experienced in years. He watched as she put the sweater on over her torn clothes, noticing how the blue color highlighted her green eyes. "It looks perfect on you," he said softly. During breakfast, Richard decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking direct questions about her, he began to tell stories about Aspen Springs, about the first tourists who came to the city, about how the hotels were built in the mountains. The girl listened with growing attention, and Richard realized that she was intelligent, absorbing every detail of his narratives. "Do you like stories?" he asked. She nodded energetically for the first time, and Richard felt that he had finally found a way to connect with her. "My daughter liked them too," the words came out before he could stop them. The silence that followed was heavy. The girl looked at him with a different intensity, as if trying to read something in his expression. Richard realized that he had revealed more than he intended, but he didn't regret it. "Her name was Claire," he continued, surprising himself. "She had hair similar to yours and the same green eyes." The girl tilted her head slightly, a gesture that Richard interpreted as interest, perhaps even understanding. When she stood up to leave, Richard made another impulsive decision. "Would you like to see where I work?" he asked. "I have some books there that you might like." She stopped, clearly considering the proposal. After a few seconds, she nodded almost imperceptibly. Richard's office was on the top floor of a modern building in downtown Aspen Springs with a panoramic view of the mountains. The girl walked through the elegant corridors with contained curiosity, observing every detail of the paintings on the walls, the Persian rugs, the refined furniture. When they reached Richard's office, she became particularly interested in the bookshelf that occupied an entire wall. Richard noticed her eyes fixing on a specific section, illustrated children's books that had belonged to Claire. "You can take any one you want," Richard offered. She approached the shelf and, after a few minutes of careful observation, chose a fairy tale book with colorful illustrations. Richard felt a tightness in his chest as he recognized it. It was Claire's favorite book. "Good choice," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That was very special to someone I knew." They sat in comfortable armchairs while the girl leafed through the book. Richard took the opportunity to observe her more carefully. Now, with better lighting, he could see details that he had missed at the cafe. The scar on her wrist was really identical to Claire's, but there were other things that intrigued him. The shape of her face, the way she furrowed her brow when concentrating, even the way she held the book. "Do you know how to read?" Richard asked gently. She nodded and, to his surprise, began to read aloud in a low voice one of the stories. Her voice was soft, melodious, and Richard realized that she read very well for a child living on the streets. For the next hour, they remained there, she reading and he listening, occasionally making comments about the illustrations or explaining more difficult words. It was the first time in years that Richard felt genuinely at peace. When it was time for her to leave, Richard decided to ask a question that had been bothering him since their first meeting. "Do you have a family? Someone who worries about you?" The girl's expression subtly changed. She closed the book, held it against her chest, and for the first time looked truly sad. She nodded slowly but said nothing. "Where are they?" Richard gently insisted. She vaguely pointed toward the window, then made a gesture that Richard interpreted as far away or not here. Richard felt that he had touched on something painful and decided not to push. Instead, he offered to take her back to the library in his car. During the journey, she observed everything carefully, especially when they passed by Aspen Springs General Hospital. "Do you know this place?" Richard asked, noticing her interest. She nodded and, to his surprise, pointed to the hospital entrance. Richard stopped the car. "Do you want to go in?" She hesitated, then nodded again. Richard parked, and they walked together to the main entrance. There, the girl seemed to know exactly where to go. She walked through the corridors with the confidence of someone who knew the place well, and Richard followed her, increasingly intrigued. They reached the long-term care ward, where patients in serious condition received treatment. The girl stopped in front of room 247 and looked through the door's glass window. Richard approached and saw a woman of about 60, connected to machines, clearly in a vegetative state. The sign on the door said Martha Wilson. The girl looked at Richard with an expression that mixed sadness and hope, as if she wanted to explain something important but didn't know how. "Is she someone special to you?" Richard asked gently. She nodded emphatically, then approached the door and pressed her palm against the glass. Richard noticed that her eyes filled with tears. At that moment, a nurse approached. "Oh, it's you again," the nurse said with an affectionate smile. "Ms. Wilson will be happy to see you." Richard looked at the nurse in surprise. "You know each other?" "Of course," replied the nurse. "This little one comes here every day. She sits with Ms. Wilson, reads to her, talks to her. It's very touching, actually. No one else comes to visit the patient." Richard felt as if the ground had moved under his feet. The girl had a routine and organized life that he hadn't imagined. And at the center of that life was a woman who seemed to have no one else in the world besides her. "May I ask, what's the relationship between them?" Richard delicately questioned. The nurse lowered her voice. "Actually, no one knows for sure. The girl appeared here shortly after Ms. Wilson was admitted about 8 months ago. She doesn't talk much, but it's evident that there's a very strong connection between them." While the nurse explained the visiting procedures, Richard observed the girl, who continued with her hand against the glass, as if trying to transmit strength to the woman on the other side. A revelation was beginning to form in Richard's mind, but it was still too vague to be fully understood. All he knew was that this silent girl was becoming increasingly important in his life, and that there were mysteries surrounding her that needed to be unraveled. Richard couldn't sleep that night. The image of the girl with her hand on the hospital window remained etched in his mind, along with the expression of deep sadness in her green eyes. There was something in that scene that stirred old memories, fragments of recollections that he had buried, along with his own suffering. The following morning, he arrived at the cafe earlier than usual. He wanted time to organize his thoughts before meeting the girl again. He ordered his espresso and was observing the street movement when a sudden memory hit him like lightning. Martha Wilson. The name echoed in his mind with a disturbing familiarity. Richard closed his eyes and forced his memory to go back in time. Martha. He had known a woman with that name many years ago. She worked for his family, but not exactly for him. With his heart racing, Richard took out his phone and called Rachel, his former secretary, who had worked for the Parker family for more than 20 years before retiring. Rachel, it's Richard. I need you to help me remember something. Do you remember an employee named Martha Wilson? She worked for my brother Victor in the 90s. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Martha. Yes, of course I remember. Ms. Wilson was the housekeeper at Mr. Victor's house. A very good woman, hard-working. Why are you asking about her after so long? Richard felt the world spin around him. Rachel, do you remember if she had children? Yes, she did. A daughter, Jennifer, a pretty girl with green eyes. She sometimes came to visit her mother when she worked there. But she left town suddenly, left her mother very sad. Richard almost dropped his cup. When did this happen? It must have been in 97, 98. The girl got pregnant very young, had problems with the boy's family. Victor helped as much as he could, but she preferred to leave. Ms. Wilson was without news of her daughter for years. Richard's mind was racing. If Jennifer was Martha's daughter, and if she had left town pregnant in the 90s, could that girl at the hospital be... Rachel, do you know what happened to Martha after Victor moved? She continued working for other families in the region. She was very respected. But in recent years, I heard she was having difficulties, living alone in a small house in the South Side neighborhood. Richard thanked her and hung up, feeling as if he had discovered the first piece of a complex puzzle. When the girl arrived at the cafe, he observed her with completely new eyes. Now he saw familiar traits that he had previously ignored. The shape of her chin, the way she tilted her head when thinking, even the way she wrinkled her nose when concentrating. Your name is Lily, isn't it? Richard asked softly. The girl stopped eating and looked at him with surprise. It was the first time someone had guessed her name. She nodded slowly. And Ms. Wilson is your grandmother. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded again. Richard felt his heart tighten with emotion and sadness. Lily, I knew your grandmother many years ago. She worked for my family. The girl looked at him with an expression of disbelief mixed with hope. Richard leaned toward her, speaking in a low and caring voice. Tell me what happened. How did you end up here alone? For the first time, Lily spoke. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but each word carried an immense weight. Mom brought me to visit Grandma last year. She said she needed to resolve old problems, ask for forgiveness. We stayed at Grandma's house for a few weeks. Richard listened in silence, realizing that she had chosen to trust him with her story. But Mom started getting sick. She coughed a lot, had fever. Grandma got very worried and took her to the hospital. Lily paused, wiping away the tears that began to fall. The doctors said she needed treatment in Denver, at a special hospital. Richard felt a tightness in his chest, imagining the suffering of that child. Mom told me she would be back soon, that I should stay and take care of Grandma. But before she traveled, Grandma fainted at home. When we got to the hospital, she wouldn't wake up anymore. And your mother? She left that same night. She said when Grandma woke up, she would be back. But that was 8 months ago. Richard needed a few seconds to process the information. Jennifer had left her daughter in Martha's care, but Martha had fallen into a coma before any proper arrangement could be made. Lily had been left completely alone. How did you manage to survive all this time? At first, I stayed at Grandma's house, but the neighbors started asking questions, and I was afraid they would take me to an orphanage. A lady named Alice helped me sometimes, but then she moved away. I found the abandoned library and made a little corner there. Richard was impressed with the courage and intelligence of that girl. And you go to the hospital every day? Every day. I read to Grandma, Tell her what I did. Talk about the school I would like to attend. The doctors say people in comas sometimes hear. School? You're not studying? Lily shook her head. I don't have my documents with me. Mom took everything when she traveled. Richard felt a wave of indignation and protection that he hadn't experienced in years. That girl, his grandniece, was living as an orphan when she had family. His family. Lily, I need to tell you something important. Your grandmother Martha worked for my brother Victor. That makes us family. Lily looked at him with wide eyes. Family? Yes, you're my grandniece. Victor was my older brother. Richard paused, too emotional to continue. You'll never have to be alone again. For the first time since they met, Lily smiled a complete smile that illuminated her entire face. Richard felt as if the sun had returned to shine in his life after years of darkness. Can we visit Grandma together? She asked timidly. Of course we can, and we'll talk to the doctors about her treatment. We'll do everything possible. As they walked toward the hospital, Richard felt that his life had gained a completely new purpose. Not only had he found a family he didn't know he had, but he had found a reason to live fully again. At the hospital, Richard spoke at length with Dr. Henry Carter, the doctor responsible for Martha. He learned that her condition was stable, but that the costs of treatment were accumulating without anyone assuming financial responsibility. Now there is, Richard said firmly. I'll assume all costs, and I want her to have the best treatment available. Dr. Carter seemed relieved. It will be a pleasure to take better care of Miss Wilson. And this little one, he looked affectionately at Lily, will finally have the proper care she deserves. When they left the hospital, Richard made a decision that would change everything. Lily, what do you think about coming to live with me? I can enroll you in a good school, you'll have your own room, and we can visit your grandmother every day. Lily stopped walking and looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Really? Really? We're family now. But Richard didn't imagine that this decision would awaken forces in his professional life that would try to destroy everything he was beginning to rebuild. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. The first week with Lily in Richard's mansion was like rediscovering colors that he had forgotten existed. The house, which for years had remained silent and cold, now echoed with small steps running through the corridors, laughter during breakfast, and the soft sound of pages being turned in the room that Richard had transformed into a small sanctuary for the girl. Lily adapted with an ease that surprised them both. Richard hired Melanie, an experienced educator, to accompany the girl's studies and provide for her school regularization. He also called Connie, a caring housekeeper who had worked for the family years ago, to help with daily care. She's a special child, commented Melanie after the first week of classes. Very intelligent, but carries a maturity that isn't common in children her age. Richard knew that Lily had been forced to grow up too quickly, but he was determined to give her back the childhood she had lost. He bought books, toys, colorful clothes, and most importantly, dedicated time. Every afternoon after work, they sat together in the house library for homework or simply to talk. It was during one of these afternoons that Richard received a call that would change everything. Richard, I need to speak with you urgently. The tense voice of Marcus Foster, his executive vice president, echoed on the other end. There are rumors circulating in the board that may affect your position in the company. Richard frowned. Marcus had always been ambitious, but in recent months he seemed especially interested in taking on more responsibilities. What kind of rumors? About your recent decisions. Some investors are questioning your emotional stability. The situation with the girl is generating comments. Richard felt his blood freeze. What situation? Lily is my grandniece. I'm taking care of a family member. Richard, you need to understand how this looks from the outside. A single businessman taking in a child who was living on the streets, without proper documentation, spending fortunes on medical treatments for a woman in a coma. There are people questioning your judgment. My judgment is perfectly fine, Marcus, and frankly, I don't see how my personal life affects my ability to run my own company. Your own company that has minority shareholders and a board of directors, Marcus retorted with a coldness that Richard had never noticed before. Richard, I'm your friend, that's why I'm warning you. An extraordinary meeting is being called for next Friday. Richard hung up the phone with an uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. For years he had built Parker Resorts as a solid empire, but he had always kept majority control in his own hands. Now for the first time he realized that his position wasn't as unshakable as he had imagined. That night during dinner, Lily noticed that he was worried. "Uncle Richard, are you sad?" she asked, using the family title they had established for the first time. Richard looked at this girl who in such a short time had become the center of his new life. Her green eyes shone with genuine concern, and he realized that he didn't want to carry this burden alone. "I'm facing some problems at work, Lil, but nothing we can't solve." "Is it because of me?" Her voice was small, full of fear. Richard immediately stood up and went to her, kneeling beside her chair. "Never ever think that. You are the best thing that has happened in my life in many years. If there are people who can't understand that, the problem is theirs, not ours." Lily smiled, but Richard saw that the worry hadn't completely disappeared from her eyes. In the following days, Richard immersed himself in a detailed analysis of the company's shareholder structure. He discovered to his surprise and alarm that Marcus had been discreetly acquiring shares from small investors over the past 2 years. Alone, he still didn't represent a threat, but in coalition with other board members, he could create serious problems. The situation became even more complicated when Richard received an unexpected visit at his office. Dr. Patricia Miller, from the Child Protection Services of Aspen Springs, arrived accompanied by a social worker. "Mr. Parker, we received an anonymous complaint about the irregular situation of a minor under your care," she explained in a formal but not hostile manner. Richard remained calm, although he felt anger growing inside him. "Lily is my grandniece, Doctor. I am arranging all the necessary documentation to formalize her guardianship." "We understand, sir. But until that is officially formalized, we need to verify the conditions in which the child is living and if there is really proven kinship." Richard provided all the documents he had managed to gather so far: family birth certificates, Martha's work records, testimonies from Rachel and other former employees confirming the family connection. Moreover, Richard added, "Lily is receiving pedagogical support, medical care, and has been visiting her grandmother at the hospital daily. She is being very well cared for." Dr. Miller carefully examined the documents. "The documents seem in order, Mr. Parker, but we will need to make a home visit and an interview with the child to make sure she is safe and happy." "Whenever you want. Our home is always open." After the Child Protection Services team left, Richard called his private attorney, Dr. Robert Adams. "Robert, I need to speed up Lily's guardianship process, and I want you to investigate who made this complaint." "I'll take care of it, Richard. But tell me something. Is there anything in your situation that could be used against you? Any problem I'm not seeing?" Richard thought for a moment. "Nothing beyond the fact that some people believe a single man shouldn't take care of a child alone. That's not a crime, Richard. In fact, it's commendable. We'll work to formalize everything quickly." On Friday, Richard entered the meeting room of Parker Resorts with the determination of someone fighting for their own survival. The board members were already present: Marcus Foster, Dr. August Peterson, representative of minority investors, Dr. Sophia Morgan, financial consultant, and Charles Mitchell, Richard's old partner. "Richard," Marcus began with a tone that tried to be conciliatory, "thank you for coming. We know you've been going through significant personal changes lately." "Changes that do not affect my ability to run this company in any way," Richard responded firmly. Dr. Peterson leaned forward. "Richard, we all respect your trajectory and success, but there are legitimate concerns. Extraordinary expenses without board approval, personal decisions that may affect the company's image." "What extraordinary expenses?" Richard questioned. "The medical expenses for the woman in the hospital, the hiring of domestic staff, the costs with the child," Marcus enumerated as if reading a list of crimes. Richard felt anger explode inside. "Him. These are personal expenses made with my own money. In what world has this become board business? In the world where you are the CEO of a publicly traded company, even if a majority owner," Dr. Morgan intervened, "your public image affects our business. So you're questioning my leadership because I decided to take care of a child from my family?" The silence that followed was eloquent. Richard realized that he was facing something much bigger than simple business concerns. It was a calculated move to remove him from control of the company he himself had built. "I would like to propose a motion of vote of confidence," Marcus finally said, "so we can move forward with security." Richard looked around the table, seeing faces he had known for years, people with whom he had built businesses and shared successes. Now they were ready to question him for having found a reason to live again. "Very well," he said calmly. "Let's vote. But I make it clear that, regardless of the outcome, I will not abandon Lily. She is my family now." The vote would take place on the following Monday, giving time for everyone to adequately reflect on the situation. Richard left the meeting knowing that he was facing the most important fight of his life, not just for the company, but for the right to choose his own path. The weekend passed like an eternity. Richard tried to maintain normality at home, but Lily noticed his growing tension. On Sunday morning, while visiting Martha at the hospital, the girl asked a question that caught him off guard. "Uncle Richard, if something happens to you, will I have to go back to the library?" Richard stopped walking in the hospital corridor and knelt in front of her. "Lil, I promise that will never happen. No matter what we face, we'll face it together." But even making that promise, Richard knew that Monday's vote could change everything. If he lost control of the company, his financial stability would be shaken, and that could affect Lily's guardianship process. It was in this moment of anguish that something extraordinary happened. While Lily was reading a story to Martha, Richard noticed that the patient's monitors began to show different patterns. Martha's eyelids fluttered slightly. "Doctor," Richard called the nurse on duty. "I think Ms. Wilson is responding." Dr. Henry was immediately called. After a few minutes of examinations, he confirmed what Richard had noticed. "There are signs that she is beginning to come out of the coma. These are just the first indications, but it's the most significant progress we've had in months." Lily held her grandmother's hand with tears in her eyes. "Grandma, it's Uncle Richard. He's from our family, remember? He's taking care of me." To everyone's amazement, Martha slightly squeezed Lily's hand. It was a subtle reaction, but undeniable. "This is a miracle," murmured Dr. Henry. "I'll adjust the treatment immediately." With this response, there are real chances of recovery. Richard felt as if he had received a sign from the universe. Perhaps there was hope amid all the storm he was facing. On Monday morning, Richard arrived at the office determined to fight. But before the board meeting, he received an unexpected call from Dr. Robert, his lawyer. "Richard, you need to know something urgent. I discovered who made the complaint to Child Protection Services." "Who was it?" "Tvanakinas Iskandabagias, Marcus Foster. He hired a private investigator to search through your personal life and find ammunition to use against you." Richard felt a cold anger taking over him. "He went that far?" "There's more. I obtained documents showing that Marcus is secretly negotiating with a group of foreign investors to buy a majority stake in the company. The whole play was planned to force your exit." Richard leaned back in his chair, processing the information. So it has nothing to do with Lily, really. She was just the excuse he found. "Richard, with this evidence, we can publicly expose Marcus and destroy his plans." "No," Richard said after a pause. "I'll confront him directly at the meeting. I want to see him explain his actions in front of everyone." At 2 in the afternoon, Richard entered the meeting room carrying a folder with the documents that Robert had obtained. The board members were present, along with some minority shareholders who had been invited to the vote. "Before we proceed with any vote," Richard began, "I think everyone deserves to know the truth about what's really happening here." Marcus seemed slightly nervous, but maintained his composure. "Richard, let's stick to the agenda." "The agenda is exactly about this, Marcus." Richard opened the folder and distributed copies of the documents. "I want everyone to see the secret contracts our vice president has been negotiating with foreign investors, the reports from the private investigator he hired to spy on me, and the evidence that it was he who made the false complaint to Child Protection Services." The silence in the room was deafening. The board members examined the documents with expressions of growing shock. Dr. Peterson was the first to speak. "Marcus, is this true?" Marcus tried to stay calm, but Richard could see the panic in his eyes. "These are just business precautions." "Richard is clearly unstable." "Unstable?" Richard stood up. "Marcus, I found a child from my family living on the streets and decided to take care of her. Does that bother you so much that you're willing to destroy an entire company to remove me?" Dr. Morgan examined the contracts. "These documents show that you were selling confidential company information to facilitate the acquisition. This is corporate treason." Charles Mitchell shook his head in disgust. "Marcus, we've worked together for years. How could you do this?" Marcus realized that his position was untenable. "You don't understand. Richard has lost focus. The company needs strong leadership, not someone who makes emotional decisions." "Emotional decisions?" Richard laughed bitterly. "You're talking about the man who transformed a small family inn into one of the largest hotel chains in the mountains. Marcus, my emotional decision was discovering that I can still love and care for someone. If that scares you so much, maybe you're the one who shouldn't be here." At that moment, the door to the room opened and Dr. Robert entered, accompanied by 2 detectives from the police department. "Mr. Foster," one of the detectives said, "we need to talk to you about leaking confidential information and attempted extortion." Marcus turned completely pale. "This is ridiculous." "It's not ridiculous when we have recordings of your conversations with foreign investors," Dr. Robert calmly explained, "and witnesses to your attempts at emotional blackmail against Mr. Parker." As Marcus was escorted out of the room by the detectives, Richard looked at the remaining board members. "Now, I'd like to clarify something for everyone. Lily is not an emotional decision or a distraction. She is my family, and caring for her has made me a better person and a more complete leader. If you can't see that, then perhaps it's time to rethink our partnership." Dr. Peterson stood up. "Richard, I think I speak for everyone when I say we admire your position. We were deceived by Marcus and we apologize." Dr. Morgan nodded. "The company is in safe hands. In fact, it has never been better," Charles smiled. "And I want to meet this grandniece who caused all this turnaround." Richard felt an enormous relief taking over him. "You are welcome in our home whenever you wish." When Richard arrived home that afternoon, he found Lily in the garden playing with a golden retriever puppy that Connie had suggested as a companion for the girl. "Uncle Richard." She ran in his direction. "This is Zeus." "Connie said you approved." Richard picked her up, feeling a complete happiness that he hadn't experienced in years. "I approve completely, and I have more good news. Your grandmother is improving, and all the problems at work have been resolved." "Does that mean we can stay together forever?" "Forever," Richard confirmed, knowing that this was the most important promise he had ever made in his life. That night, while Richard was helping Lily with her homework, she stopped writing and looked at him seriously. "Uncle Richard, do you think Mum will come back?" Richard carefully considered his response. "I don't know, Lil, but I know that whatever happens, you will always have a family that loves you. And when your grandmother fully recovers, we'll be 3. Lily smiled and went back to writing. "I'll tell Grandma that tomorrow. She'll be very happy." Richard observed that extraordinary girl who had completely transformed his life and realized that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. Lily hadn't just entered his life, she had saved his soul. 3 months later, on a golden September morning, Aspen Springs was awakening with the aroma of spring flowers mixed with the cold mountain air. Richard was in the mansion's garden watching Lily teach tricks to Zeus when his phone rang. "Richard," Dr. Henry's emotional voice echoed from the other end of the line. "You need to come to the hospital immediately. Ms. Wilson has fully awakened." Richard felt his heart speed up. In recent months, Martha had shown progressive signs of improvement, increasingly longer moments of consciousness, but this was the news everyone had been waiting for. "Lil," he called, seeing the girl's eyes instantly light up. "Grandma? She's awake! We're going to the hospital now." The race to the hospital was filled with expectation and nervousness. Lily held Richard's hand firmly, alternating between anxious smiles and tears of joy. In room 247, they found Martha sitting on the bed, supported by pillows, with clear and attentive eyes. When she saw Lily, her face lit up with a radiant smile. "My darling granddaughter." Martha extended her arms, and Lily ran to nestle in them. "Grandma, I knew you would wake up. I read to you every day, told you stories, talked about Uncle Richard." Martha looked over Lily's head to Richard, who remained discreetly near the door. Her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "You're Richard Parker," she said with a voice still weak but firm. "Lily told me everything. Thank you for taking care of my granddaughter." Richard approached the bed. "Ms. Wilson, you don't need to thank me. Lily is family." "Yes," Martha smiled. "She told me she discovered our connection with your family. Victor was always a good employer. He talked a lot about you." During the next hour, Martha gradually regained more strength and clarity. She said she remembered fragments of the past months, especially Lily's voice reading to her. "My granddaughter kept me alive," she said, stroking the girl's hair. "Her love brought me back." Dr. Henry explained that, although the recovery was exceptional, Martha would need a few weeks of physical therapy before being discharged. "But I can guarantee that she will recover completely," he said with a smile. "It's one of the most remarkable cases I've ever witnessed." That afternoon, as they were returning home, Lily was more talkative than Richard had ever seen her. "Uncle Richard, now that Grandma is well, can she come live with us?" "Of course. In fact, I'm already arranging for the ground floor room to be adapted for her." "And can Zeus sleep in her room?" "He's very affectionate," Richard laughed. "I'm sure your grandmother will love the company." The following week, an unexpected surprise again changed the dynamics of the newly formed family. Richard was in a meeting when Connie called, visibly agitated. "Mr. Richard, there's a young woman here at the house. She says she's Lily's mother." Richard felt the world spin. "Where is Lily?" "She's at school. The woman arrived a few minutes ago. She's very thin. Looks like she's been through hardships. I'm coming home now. Don't let her leave." Richard cancelled all meetings and rushed home. He found a woman of about 30 sitting in the living room, clearly nervous. She had the same green eyes as Lily, but appeared to have gone through difficult trials. "You're Jennifer?" Richard asked. She nodded with tears in her eyes. "I am Lily's mother. I've come to get her." Richard felt a mixture of relief to know she was alive and terror at the possibility of losing Lily. "Where have you been during these months?" Jennifer told a story of suffering and struggle. She had developed a serious lung disease that required specialized treatment in Denver. For months she had been hospitalized in critical condition, unable to even communicate her location. "When I got better enough to travel, I returned immediately," she explained. "I went to my mother's house, but the neighbors said she was in the hospital and that Lily had disappeared. I was desperate until I found out that a local businessman was taking care of her." Richard observed Jennifer carefully. He could see the genuine love for Lily in her eyes, but also perceived the fragility of someone who was still recovering. "Jennifer, Lily thought you had abandoned her. She spent months alone before I found her." "I know," Jennifer cried. "It was the hardest thing in my life. But now I'm better. I can take care of her again." At that moment, Lily arrived from school. When she saw her mother, she was paralyzed for a few seconds, then ran and threw herself into her arms. "Mom, you came back." The reunion was emotional, but Richard noticed that Lily was confused. There was hurt mixed with the joy. During the following days, the situation became delicate. Jennifer wanted to take Lily away, but the girl was divided between the love for her mother and the security she had found with Richard. It was Martha who brought the solution. After being discharged from the hospital, she gathered the whole family in Richard's living room. "Jennifer," she said to her daughter, "you made mistakes, but I know you love Lily. Richard, you saved our family and gave love to Lily when she needed it most, but now we need to think about what's best for her." Lily listened attentively as the adults talked. Finally, she spoke. "I want to stay with all of you." "Mom, can you live here too?" "Uncle Richard said the house is big, and that Grandma is already going to live here." Richard looked at Jennifer, seeing hope and fear in her eyes. "Jennifer, you're welcome here. Lily needs her mother, but she's also gotten used to our family. What if we build something new together?" Jennifer hesitated for a few moments, then nodded. "I would like that very much, but I don't want to be a burden." "You would never be a burden," Richard reassured her. "Family is not a burden, it's a blessing." 6 months later, on a sunny summer afternoon, Richard was in his office when he heard laughter coming from the garden. He looked out the window and saw Lily playing with Zeus, Jennifer reading under the shade of a tree, and Martha tending to a small herb garden she had created. Connie entered the office carrying a coffee tray. "Your family is calling for a snack." "Mr. Richard." Richard smiled at hearing the words, "your family." He put away the documents and went down to join the people who had transformed his house into a true home. During the snack, Lily made an important announcement. "Uncle Richard, tomorrow we have a presentation at school about family. Can I tell our story?" "Of course, Lil. What story are you going to tell?" "I'll tell how sometimes families get lost, but always find a way to find each other again. And how love can heal anything." Richard felt his eyes water. He looked around the table, seeing Jennifer radiant and healthy, Martha strong and happy, and Lily transformed into the joyful child she should always have been. "It's a beautiful story," he said. "And the best part is that it's true." That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Richard stayed on the veranda watching the stars. Lily appeared in pajamas, carrying Zeus in her arms. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I was thinking," she said, sitting beside him. "Remember when we met at the cafe and I was afraid of everything?" "I remember. Now I'm not afraid of anything anymore, because I know that whatever happens, our family will always be together." Richard hugged the girl who had forever changed his life. "Always, Lil, that's a promise." And there, under the starry sky of Aspen Springs, Richard realized that he had discovered the true